Hello, everybody, and welcome to the General Federation of Trade Unions Educational Trust Series. I'm not sure if everyone's in the room yet. I will just wait while a few more people join us. So, as I said, this is the General Federation of Trade Unions Educational Trust Series, which is called Trade Union and Working Class History. And the series is held in partnership with the Marx Memorial Library and the Working Class Movement Library. Before I start, I would first like to give a big red salute to Anne Scargill, who, as you know, recently passed away. She was a true fighter for her class and her community, two principles that stand firm behind the discussion we're going to have tonight. So I had to get that out the way. So my name is Carolyn Jones. I am the Senior Vice President of the Institute of Employment Rights and the Assistant Secretary of the Campaign for Trade Union Freedom. And for those of you who may not know IER or CTUF, both organisations have a long and distinguished history. IER was established in 1989 by a team of lawyers, academics and trade unionists to act as a think tank for the labour movement. During the class war years waged by Thatcher against trade unions, against workers and against working class communities, IER offered an alternative narrative on the kind of laws that we needed. I was appointed its first director in 1989 and remained in that position until 2021. The Campaign for Trade Union Freedom was established in 2013 following a merger of the United Campaign to Repeal the Anti-Trade Union Laws and the Liaison Committee for the Defence of Trade Unions. I'll leave the history and the role of the Liaison Committee to our expert speaker this evening, Roger Seifert. Both the Institute of Employment Rights and the Campaign for Trade Union Freedom remain dedicated today to improving the power, the rights and the freedoms of workers and their unions. The only real difference between the two organisations is the Institute is an educational charity informing the debate around labour law, while CTUF is a campaigning organisation exposing the UK's anti-trade union laws and campaigning for their repeal. Together, in our combined efforts, IER and CTUF hope to educate, agitate and organise for a better world. So a perfect partner for the GFTU's work here tonight. So how will the event work? Well, this event is a Zoom webinar, which means you can see us, but you cannot see each other. Feel free to use the chat throughout the call, but to ask questions, we would ask that you put them in, you use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. I will then ask your questions directly to the speaker. A bit of background, tonight is the 8th session in this year's programme, and the topic of discussion will be the Liaison Committee, new rank and file organisation. We'll have a maximum of 45 minutes of presentation from Roger, followed by 45 minutes of questions, answers and comments from you, and we aim to finish at 8:30 by the very latest. During the Zoom, we will be following the GFTU's Educational Trust Behaviour Statement, the link of which is in the chat below, I believe. So be nice or you'll be out is the suggestion. So over to our speaker. Let me introduce him. As I said, our speaker tonight is Roger Seifert. Roger read PPE at Oxford University, MBA at London Business School, and did a PhD at the London School of Economics. Very intelligent man, of course. He worked for Income's Data Service before becoming a Professor of Industrial Relations at Keele University, and then on at Wolverhampton University. He specialises in trade unions, strikes, public sector pay, labour history, and the role of the state in industrial relations. He's frequently interviewed on TV and radio, mainly about strikes and about pay. Personally, I've known Roger for a good few years, and I've no doubt his talk tonight will stimulate much thought and discussion, which I look forward to listening to at the end of the evening. So, Roger, welcome, and over to you.
Okay, yes, thank you. So the first thing you didn't say, which I want to say, is I'm an old man. And at one point, I thought that was a disadvantage. But looking around the world, I realized I'm younger than the President of the United States and of similar age to the presidents of Russia, China, the Prime Minister of India, and younger than President of Brazil. So it's odd, isn't it, that over half the world's population and 2/3 of the world's economy are currently run by old men. And the relevance is that we share a common history. That is, we've been through landmarks in the development of the world, in working class struggle, in technological breakthroughs, which give us a commonality and which also make it very worrying for everyone who's younger than us, who may be the victims of deep prejudice and confusion about the modern world. And on that basis, it's very difficult sometimes to see into the past and then project that into the future. So what I'm going to do, I'm only going to give a schematic account of the Liaison Committee, mainly from 1966 when it was formed to 1976, although it went on well beyond that. Obviously, there's so much was going on at the time, so much context, that it's impossible to cover all of it, and I won't try. But I think what's important as part of the lessons of history is for today's struggle is to try to work out what are the necessary and sufficient conditions that exist for the flourishing of rank and file organizations. And I think the first thing is, as my favorite author, Lewis Carroll, always said, begin at the beginning. And the beginning for us, really, in this sort of analysis, is Marx's view of historical materialism. And I haven't got in front of me the exact quote, but I'm sure most people are familiar with it, which is simply that men and women make their own history, but they do not do so under circumstances of their own choosing. And that summary statement, in modern sociological terms, would be talking about agency. That is, the importance that people do make their own history. I'm currently finishing a study of the strikes in the West Indies in the 1930s. And one of the leading figures, C.L.R. James, made that point when he was writing the history in the Black Jacobins of the Haitian Revolution in the 1790s, which was that it was the slaves that made their own history, not their colonial masters. And these are substantial lessons because one of the things we're up against, particularly in the drift to autocracy, is the notion that it's actually other people who make our history for us. And that's one of the most important things we have to combat. So that's my first thing, that class struggle still remains the most powerful analytical device for understanding where we are and what we are and what we are, and what Lenin would famously say is what is to be done. And without that class as the absolute primacy above all other struggles, then we lose sight of what matters. And people drift away into corners, into dead ends, pursuing red herrings, because they lose their class perspective. And really that is the central point of rank and file trade unionism. Because at the end of the day, trade unions are whatever else they are, organizing centers of the working class. However we wish to define working class, but we have to take it on that there are more doctors proportionately in a union, the BMA, than there are engineering workers in Britain today. And so we can't revert to some nonsense that the doctors who work in the NHS are not part of the working class. So that seems to be the important start. Now, the other thing that matters is this allows us to have some sort of view of the balance of class forces. In other words, when we stare out of our window, as I do most of my life, and look at the world go by, when I say, what's going on? Are we winning? Are we losing? Is it a nil draw? You know, what is happening? And the balance of class forces really matters, because an appreciation of where that balance lies and where it varies and how it can be moved is critical to a strategy of intervention. In other words, we can't just say, let's go and bang on that door. Let's go and shove that statue over. We can't just say that, because that's pop-up anarchy, where you get grand gestures, but nothing else. And I find that quite irritating a lot of the time. I know the individuals involved are brave and that they mean well, but they don't help us in any way, because what they're not doing is looking at the balance of class forces and saying, where can we, with our limited resources and our limited energy, where can we most have an impact? And one of the features of the Liaison Committee was that's exactly what they did. They sat down and said, look, what's going on around us? Where can we be most effective? Not where do we want to be most effective? What would make us feel good? What would make us have a picture on the front page of the newspapers? It was, what does the class struggle require us to do that in some ways will advance that struggle? And therefore, having an analysis of the balance of class forces is absolutely central to any meaningful intervention. If you don't get that right, then you'll spend an awful lot of time, energy, and resource on the wrong thing. And I, several years ago, gave a talk to the RMT when Bob Crow was still alive, where I attacked Tusk as a waste of space on the grounds that it really didn't get anything about class struggle. It wasn't really about class struggle. And I remember Bob getting quite irate about it, as he would, in a friendly way. But I had to run out the room in the end. So what else is there? Well, the other thing is, which really finds, it's very difficult for most of us, and that's the context. Because we can't simply pluck from the past good ideas or brilliant examples of militancy like the Upper Clyde shipbuilders sit here. We can't just do that and say, let's do that because it worked. And I noticed that some of the Just Stop Oil people constantly refer to the suffragettes. Well, but that's classic, isn't it? It's a classic error. It's a mistake to think like that, because that was a struggle then in their context with their particular tactics. You can't just say, because great people in the past did it and it really worked and hurrah, that we can become like that. It just shows their arrogance, really, and in my view, their separation from everyday life and everyday struggle. So I think the context is particularly important, that we learn the lessons, but we don't necessarily have to repeat and replicate them in any serious sense.
Roger, can I just interrupt you for 1 minute? There is a comment in the chat that says we can only see the top of your head.
Oh, well, that's good.
If you can tilt your camera.
Yeah,
now that's better? There you go. We can see you. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, it's perfectly acceptable. So the question then is, when we're looking at this balance of class forces, when we're looking at what's going on, the first thing, and this has tormented Marxists for a very long time, is the composition of the working class. In other words, is the famous river that we sit and see stream past us the same river? Is the working class the same composition as it was in the 1960s or even in the 1930s? What's going on? And if it's not, and it clearly isn't, what has shifted, what has changed, and what within that shift and change matters to us? So one of the features of it is this question of self-employment, fake or not, where that has shifted. Precarious employment is another question. There's a whole range of issues around the composition of the working class, even if we want to argue that the vast majority of people are still members and part of the working class. If the composition has shifted, that may lead to shifts in consciousness, in shifts of whether they are part of a class in and of itself. So that matters. And of course, that partly, as we mustn't forget, is dependent on the concentration of capital. And we see a very odd phenomenon, which we haven't seen before, which is tech companies in America, where, you know, these guys are billionaires, but they do make an enormous amount of product or buy in an enormous amount of product. But the numbers of people employed to make those products and make those enormous profits is tiny compared to the heyday of the car industry and the coal mines, where we're talking about 1 million workers. So you've got relatively small numbers of workers creating enormous value added, creating billionaires. Some people call it that we've moved into this era of feudal tech, where we're all vassals of the technology companies ultimately. And maybe that's what Trump is about. So that's quite difficult. What is the current concentration of capital? How does it flit between countries and organizations? What was called the Big Bang in the 1980s, when they massively deregulated the finance sector. And we talk about finance capital, but I'm not always sure our grasp of it is as intense as it should be. Now, as Ryan said, I read PP at Oxford like Liz Truss and David Cameron and Rishi Sunak, and of course, Rachel Reeves. So probably you don't want to take any notice of what I say when I talk about finance capital, as they clearly haven't even an elementary grasp of it. Okay, so what else is going on? All of this leads to this position. How do we leverage working class power? Because at the end of the day, it is about power. Class is a power struggle. The role of the state is about the exercise of power. And the question is, how can we maximize the leverage of power for the working class movement, given our strengths, weaknesses, and reach? And that is very important. And that really is what the Liaison Committee was so good at. It leveraged, it was astonishing, really, given what it was, enormous amount of power very quickly in particular circumstances. So obviously we're interested in the methods that they used and the means by which they were able to achieve their aims. And for those who are younger and or less familiar with this torrid period of working class history between in the 60s and 70s, I mean, we simply can't keep rewinding. So if we start with 64, where Harold Wilson won the election, and this was after, as we always said, 13 years of Tory rule, known as the wasted 13 years. And he came in on a platform of modernizing capitalism. And this is very important, because those people who say, oh, Starmer, Blair, blah, no, they're all the same. I mean, basically, they're no different fundamentally from Wilson. It was the context within which Wilson's government and Callaghan's government functioned that make them look a bit different. But they weren't. Fundamentally, their proposition of right-wing social democrats is the same. And it's not stupid, it's not foolish, it's not irrelevant, which is, if capitalism works well, if capitalism works better, if national capital, British capital, works even better, then the working class will benefit. And of course, significant numbers of trade unionists accept that. There's no, I mean, I live near Stoke-on-Trent and I regularly meet with the trade union and Labour people. The biggest employer is Bet365, owned by the Coates family, and Denise Coates is very modest. She only pays herself £5 million a week as the richest woman in Britain. And I say, look, you know, this is terrible. And they say, no, she's the biggest employer in Stoke-on-Trent. The pottery industry's failing, the pit's shut, the steel factory's shut. And we need to actually thank her for staying here, because she could take her business elsewhere. So there's a deep-seated relationship between the notion that a successful capitalist business helps workers and they pay their taxes so they help pay for benefits in the welfare state. A very clear indicative relationship between that view and the view that if somehow we can make capitalism work better. Now, this is 100% the mantra of Starmer and Reeves, there's no question, and they're not being odd about it. They're saying, if we can get growth, if we can get better, then there's more for everybody. They're famous. If the cake gets bigger, then even if you've only got a small slice, you'll still be better off. Now, Wilson said exactly that in 1964. He said, we need a technological revolution. We need to modernize British capital. And of course, one argument is that that is the historic function of social democracy, that its major purpose is to have years where you can get state intervention to transfer money from working people to capitalist investment in order to modernize the economy. And once they've done that, then they can go and we can get the Tories back and be happy again. So the Labour victory in 64 was that, but it was more than that. And we have to be careful of not just reducing everything to an economic policy base. It was much more than that. It was an enormous relief because it was coming at the time of a post-war generation who were moving, as we know, into a culturally new world, into even the Cold War was beginning to unfreeze somewhat. And there was a sense of revolt amongst students, amongst young workers, amongst women workers. This was a significant shift. So it wasn't just Wilson saying, I'm going to modernize capitalism. The notion was that that also entailed a modernizing of the struggle, of the cultural forms within that struggle, and increasingly to the forefront came people's rights, gay rights, women's rights, and the rights of minorities within our society. And that seemed to be very important. Now, what happened very early on, and this is the critical setting up of the Liaison Committee, was that Wilson, in those days, by the way, we didn't have tariffs, we had a balance of payments crisis. So instead of every other day, if you remember in the 10 years ago, it was the deficit. In those days, every other day, the BBC would report on the balance of payments. And Wilson basically was saying we have to trade our way out, we have export, import. And lo and behold, the seafarers decided to go on strike in 1966. And this was absolutely critical. Now, remember the international context, which is relevant. Vietnam, Cuba, South Africa, Palestine, some never go away, others are not resolved, others have been partially resolved. But there was an internationally frenetic sense that we were part of a changing world, that struggle was real and in many cases was a matter of life and death. And into this came the question of the seafarers. Now, one reason why rank and file movements developed was because of the deeply reactionary nature of trade union leaders. And we don't just mean they had right-wing, unpleasant, misogynist and racist views, which many of them did, but they also were absolutely the epitome of class collaboration. There was no question they were in bed with the employers and they were selling their members short day in, day in, day out for peerages and in many cases for actual bribes. And the National Seaman was a very clear case. So the notion was we needed as rank and file developed. And I was lucky enough to interview some of the activists who led the seafarer strike when they were old, before they passed away. And they told me, you know, they didn't have mobile phones. They literally got on a train from London to Liverpool and slept on the floor of their mates and talked. And then they went back and talked again, and they didn't use the telephone. They didn't need any of that. They still did it. They got around and they gave their lives to the movement. And what happened was that strike caused the trigger for a lot of other things. So one of the triggers was that Harold Wilson, the Labour Prime Minister, made a speech in the House of Commons in which he named the leaders of the seafarer strike as saying that these were communists. And he actually said a small group of politically motivated men, as if he wasn't part of a small group of politically motivated men and women running the government. But interestingly, the official MI5 records show that they told him not to do it. They said, you really mustn't do it. No one had ever done it. No one had actually named people in that circumstance. And Wilson said, never mind, I don't care. I'm going to out them. So as far as he was concerned, the enemy were the communists. The enemy were the rank and file. And that was a classic Labour government mistake, because by branding them as such, he gave them enormous credibility. And that credibility of being named by the Prime Minister as being able to actually disrupt the whole British economy meant, wow, we can do it. We can actually disrupt the economy. We have far more power than we thought we had. So Wilson gifted to the rank and file. And what happened from that was a recognition by Kevin Halpin, the founder, with his friends Lou Lewis and Ben Hiles, that was the moment where they understood that they could link together all these disparate rank and file movements. But Ramilson had been working as the Communist Party industrial organizer in Yorkshire and developing the rank and file left opposition in the NUM to what was a very right-wing group. And of course, Arthur Scargill came through those ranks. So what was happening was there was progress in the pits. The NUM was being shifted to one way. There was progress in engineering. And now we had the catalyst. And what absolutely happened was on the 3rd of December 1966, they had their first meeting. And that was ridiculous. You know, it was remarkable because they called the meeting, and you'll forgive me if I have to remind myself of some of this. And what the people who attended were the critical activists. Now, one of the necessary conditions for this was that you had a reactionary union leadership. But what the Liaison Committee didn't do was to say, we're a parallel organization to the officials. That's not what they said. They said, if we can win posts, if we can have left-wingers in office, that's even better. It's better because we don't need to have rank and file pushing to the left. What we can do is we can link up with them. So they took an incredibly sophisticated dialectical view that trade union officials, elected officers, were part of the struggle if they were on the left. It was their politics that mattered, not their office holding. And that was in sharp contrast to some of the Trotskyist positions of the time who took the childish, well, what Lenin would call the infantile view that as soon as you become a trade union official, you become a bureaucrat and you turn against your own people. I mean, the theory for that is, you know, bourgeois political science. It's not a Marxist position. It's entirely a bourgeois position. But they understood that that was wrong, that you fought to get people elected and you fought, if you had a right-wing leadership, to shift policy and position. And their slogan was unity in action. And to a large extent, they did themselves take heart and knowledge from the national minority movement, which had been flourishing in the 1920s and 30s, which itself linked to the national unemployed workers movement. So they had a model, they had some notion that this could work on a mass scale. And they began to take serious note of what was going on. And what happened quite quickly as in 67, 68, were firstly, there were exogenous shockwaves to the socialist movement. The Prague Spring had a really shocking effect on comrades and fellow travelers. It confused, it split, and it caused agony within the leadership of many Western communist parties. And that was a real issue. That was a real issue. So you had and then you had the endogenous shocks, that is within the system in 1967, of a tragic budget deficit, of a run on the pound, of a collapse of Wilson's policies. And that's when the Liaison Committee understood, as part of a wider Communist Party position, that it wasn't sufficient to be endlessly critical. You couldn't just say, you're wrong, and we told you so. Ha ha, you're wrong, and we told you so. They said we have to have an alternative economic strategy. We have to have something positive to take to the shop stewards, to take to union branches, to take to the pub, to take wherever we met, in community groups, in pressure groups, wherever, to say, look, we're not just saying you're wrong, we're saying there is an alternative, that there's a better way of doing it. And that combination of critical analysis of what was going wrong, and at the same time, a positive path forward through the alternative economic strategy, which still remains with us. It wasn't a crude nationalize everything strategy. It wasn't a crude take into state ownership and control finance, capital, and everything. It wasn't like that. That's just, mindless ticking a box. What it was much more rooted in realities of everyday working class experience. It's much more to do with how do we run the coal industry, which after all was publicly owned. How can we run that better? How can we bring in new methods? How can we improve wages and productivity? It was entirely a positive step. And the notion was that if we can show that this is a better way of running public services, if we can show that actually utilities can be run better, then we could say, if it works for these, then it can work elsewhere. So it was extremely important. And it showed that worker participation, ideas from the shop floor, could make a difference. So really, they used the victory of 1925, the 100th anniversary this year of Red Friday, where mobilizing through the TUC, they were able to turn a Tory government backing the coal owners to take a reverse position. But they also learned that a year later, the Tories came after them and were better prepared in the 1926 general strike, where the TUC bottled it. So the TUC plays an important role in their thinking. They don't dismissive. What they did, and this was the method which we're all familiar with, which is that you push for progressive resolutions. You go to your branch, you win the debate, you push for the policy, goes to national unions that adopt a policy, then goes to the TUC. And even if you lose, the debate is there. You get it into the open, you make a persuasive case. And so a lot of what they were about was propaganda. And I was lucky enough a few years ago, Anita Halpin allowed me to visit her house, made me a very pleasant lunch, and let me see all of Kevin's papers. So I was able to go through his handwritten notes and to see how they were trying to push one way and the other. But it wasn't extreme. It wasn't, we're going to win the revolution now, and if we don't have that, then you're a bunch of reactionary bastards. It was absolutely realistic. So it would be different motions for different industries, different types of workers in different parts of the country. It was entirely grounded in the realities of everyday life. And that's what rank and file means, if it means anything. But then we move on to the late 60s. And this is where, by the way, I normally start with this, but I thought I'd keep you waiting with excitement. And that is, I've become obsessed with the four horsemen of the apocalypse. I'm afraid. War, conquest, disease, famine as one, and of course, death on a pale horse. And if we look around, we're just about there now. And this is what things began to look like by the time we get to the late 60s, because what is happening is the Cold War and the Communist International is fragmenting and fracturing. But more important at home, Barbara Castle introduces legislation to curtail union rights. Because what happens is that the bourgeois economists began to take the view that it was wages that were the major problem as they saw it. And therefore, to control wages, you needed to control the trade unions. Now, this was founded on the famous Donovan Report of 1968, which, to be honest, without which I would not have had a job and wouldn't been able to be a professor of industrial relations, because basically these jobs don't exist in other countries. And we only had industrial relations in Britain because of Donovan. And all the good and the great academics like Hugh Clegg and Alan Fox and Bain and McCarthy all made their names and got their peerages and knighthoods and professorships on the basis of what they did for Donovan. And basically, Donovan was a sophisticated incorporation of the trade unions. It was just a restating of Fabian labourism in a, as I said, a more sophisticated and modern version. But it provided the intellectual and academic cover for a crude attempt by the outgoing, as it proved, Labour government to attack unions, feed into the frenzy that the unions were the problem, that they were holding the country back, and thereby controlling wages. So the wages movement, the wages issue becomes centre stage. And this again allowed the Liaison Committee to call massive meetings. They had literally 1,500 to 2,000 delegates coming to meetings, forcing the TUC into action, really raising consciousness through Bert Ramelson's endless pamphlets and pushing the line right across in every branch and every union where they were able to say, look, it's not wages, it's profits. Because if you're going to have a national prices income abroad, then why is it that prices aren't being controlled? Why isn't it profits are being controlled? So what they were able to do were unmask not only the Labour government, but those trade union leaders that were supporting the Labour government. They were literally able to construct unity and solidarity around a position that said, why are we, the workers, the employees, being targeted? What about the profit making? What about the prices? Why aren't you attacking those? So the class basis of labourism, the class basis of our society was as clear as it had not been for many years. No one could doubt this was class war, but this was class war being waged by a Labour government against its own supporters, by British capital against British workers. And that was a central question, without any doubt, that enabled the Liaison Committee to grow and get more and more dynamic, even though it was a shoestring. You know, there was no resources, there was virtually nobody in the leadership, but they were able, through clarity of analysis, to push the question. But at the same time, as I said, to seek to win left-wing leaders of the movement. So that sadly takes us up to 1970. And the Conservative government wins the election, which wasn't surprising. Wilson was surprised because Edward Heath was such an appalling opponent. But most people weren't surprised. If you kick working class in the teeth, as we see time and time again, they won't vote for you. Oh, what a surprise. So what happened was, and then the Tories did another massive favour to the left and the Liaison Committee. They introduced the 1971 Industrial Relations Act. Now, as Caroline said, I was doing a PhD at the London School of Economics, and my supervisor, Professor Ben Roberts, was actually the advisor to the government, which was great because I meant I never saw him, which was probably a good thing. But also, when he did deign to come and talk to us, we got some good inside information about the thinking behind the act. And again, it was one of these bits where sometimes the left struggle when there's a schism between the interests of capital and the behavior of the representatives of capital. It may be what we're seeing in America today, where the elected representatives, the Conservative Party in 1971, who are there to act on behalf of capitalists, actually acting in a way that most of the capitalists didn't want them. So we then got, if those of you will remember when the contracts came out and they tried to enforce the legislation, we got that famous Tina Lee, this is not a legally enforceable agreement. So what people were doing is they didn't want it. The big companies didn't want it. It was a propaganda device which backfired, because on the basis of that, the Liaison Committee were able to persuade the TUC to launch its Kill the Bill. Not Kill Bill, which was a rather good film, I always felt, but Kill the Bill. And those slogans were terrific. Kill the Bill rang through trade union branches, community activists, communists, laborists, everyone through the movement. And it enabled them to have over 100,000 demonstrating in London. And throughout the spring and summer of 1971, they were able to call for a boycott of the act. I mean, it caused tension within some of the unions, but basically it helped shift the leadership to the left. It helped win left positions. It helped win left policies. And the Liaison Committee was absolutely in its element. And of course, as soon as the law began to be enacted, we had the case of the Pentonville Five, the Shrewsbury pickets. I don't have time to go into all of these amazing acts of courage by our comrades. So what happens then is, and this is always a bit of a sod for the comrades, the world economy intervenes. In fact, capitalism actually is so chaotic and erratic that it even catches us by surprise. And in 73, you had the oil crisis. Again, something that resonates today. Suddenly, the price of oil went up. This was, of course, to do with wars in the Middle East, but it was mainly to do with a recognition. It was almost like what we wanted, because it was almost like a post-imperialist statement by oil producing nations saying, we've suddenly realized we don't have to keep oil prices low to favor our previous masters and mistresses. We can actually go it alone. And so in a way, it was almost like an anti-imperialist thing, but it put prices up. And of course, what does that mean for coal? It meant that suddenly coal is looking more competitive. And as soon as coal and energy begins to look more competitive, the NUM were onto it like a shot, which is, if the price of coal is going up, if you need coal as a substitute instead of oil, we can push our wages up. And you've got the 1974 miners' strike and the 3-day week, and Edward Heath, who at the time we thought was the most hapless Tory prime minister, but he's been well eclipsed many times since. It's called an election on who runs the country, me or all the people who actually provide you with energy and keep your homes warm. And he lost, obviously. In fact, there were 2 elections in 74. Now, I know I don't have much longer, Caroline, so I will try to speed up. But this crisis meant that Wilson comes back in 74. And this time, they launch what came to be known as the social contract. And the social contract, for those who are less familiar than others, was a crude deal that said to the unions, we will bring in favourable legislation particularly that you've asked for, such as equal pay, health and safety, as well as others. But in exchange, we want through the TUC for you to agree to voluntary wage restraint. It's very difficult to know what to make of it because people took it on board. We also joined what was then called the Common Market. And I remember being on the streets of North London with Jeremy Corbyn and others trying to persuade people that this was a seriously bad idea. And I have to say it was a seriously bad idea, but it meant that with these factors, plus complications around decimalisation, blah, blah, that by 1975-76, we're getting the Health and Safety Act, the Equal Pay Act, the Trade Union Labour Relations Act, the Employment Protection Act, all these things the union, the TUC particularly wanted. And what this meant was this time round, the TUC was completely within the orbit of the Labour government. And the exchange was pay restraint. Now, once we have a situation where the union leadership sign up to pay restraint, once we have our own people dampening down the wages movement, then of course the message is dire. Because what does this mean? And people were persuaded en masse, large numbers of activists included and shop stewards, that if we just held our nerve and did this, then good times would come. And going back to our friend Lewis Carroll, remember, jam tomorrow and jam yesterday, but never jam today. And that seemed to be important. Now, all of this did spur on trade union membership. So union membership grew significantly. The composition of the union membership grew with the famous surge in white-collar workers, with ASTMS slogans. My tragedy was I picked up a pen, not a shovel. And of course, significant shifts, as I've written about, in the health service unions, where COSI, which was a small union, recruited literally tens of thousands of workers in the 70s over the question of pay, as was happening within the teacher unions as well. So there's this surge of union membership, but at the same time, what is happening to the Liaison Committee? There's strikes all over the place. There's Grunwick, there's Trico, there's Leyland, there's strikes on the railways. So there's strikes, there's tension, but by the time of the 1977 Liaison Committee, there were only 100 delegates, and it was more or less over. In other words, its ability to unify and get action around wages, which was its major position, had faltered. And the Callaghan-Healy axis was able to persuade people that inflation was coming down and better things were around the corner. But they weren't, were they? Because, of course, in 79, Thatcher wins the election on a populist movement, and she does deserve huge credit for articulating the political requirements of the ruling class in terms of a coalition of workers, capitalists, small business, and others, and persuading them that their self-interest led to that. Now, the Liaison Committee really disappears. It carries on in the 80s. It, of course, backs the miners, the print workers. In the late 80s, it supported the poll tax, and it goes on into the 1990s. But really, it's of little relevance or interest to us. It finished after about 10 years. So what are the key debates? What can we take away from all of this? I need to speed up, Caroline.
Yeah,
I told you to tell me to stop rambling on. Anyway, so, well, what are the key debates? Well, I think we're particularly acute. One is, what is the Labour Party? From our point of view, what sort of organisation is it? Hobsbawm, the great historian, kept telling us that social democratic parties throughout Europe had delivered very little to the working class who voted for them. And the Democrats in America are the same. So basically they say, look, they don't work. But the Communist Party and the Liaison Committee still took the view that they were winnable. And of course, when Corbyn, quite surprisingly, and in some ways tragically, takes over as leader of the Labour Party, that vindication seems to be there. That at last we have a serious left-wing leadership that can take forward the debate. How that ended, we know. What about the other fantasies within it? The question of economic growth. Who wouldn't vote for people who are promising economic growth? Because everybody understands you have to have economic growth. Now, of course, we understand how it comes about and how it's distributed matters. And so where does that leave, if you like, the class? Since 1979, union membership has collapsed. I mean, really collapsed. It's like 10% in the private sector. I mean, 10%. Even in the public sector, it's dwindled now to below 50%. So we can blame precarious working, we can blame all sorts of things, but at the end of the day, that's the reality we face. It doesn't matter who we blame. So the ability of activists, rank and file, the leadership, but also the leadership is overwhelmingly more left-wing than it was. And I was saying to someone the other day, so what? Great, we fought to get left-wing leaders. They sound good. They're on our side. But what does it mean in terms of delivery? Are the unions growing because of a left-wing leadership? Are they winning because of a left-wing leadership? Okay, on non-wage issues, they're excellent and very important, and no one can decry that. But on the central question of the wages movement and the wages issue, what has been the difference? The communist left is also in decline. So we're in a completely different context from the 60s. And that has to be part of any analysis of the move forward. We're also, finally, if I may say, even having the question of what does socialism mean? What is socialism? What does it mean? They're culture wars which are decrying and dismissing it to such an extent that it's almost like a minority, almost like a specialist minority view. And in this era of nationalism, it may be that we have to remind people, as my mentor James Klugman pointed out, that British socialism has a significant tradition of its own, that we don't have to talk about Marx, a German, or Lenin, a Russian. We can talk about British socialism in a more national and narrow way. But I guess, sorry, the final thing is this. The Liaison Committee, the Labour Party, saw off incomes policies. We don't have incomes policies. We got rid of them. We defeated it. But what have we got? We've got public sector pay control through the pay review system. But anyway, government simply putting a ceiling on. And in the private sector, they've understood that the best way to control workers and unions is through manipulating the labour market, through immigration or not immigration, through cutting back on education and skills, from fiddling with the benefit system. So they've understood it's the labour market functions that is a much more powerful driver of defeating trade union militancy than any law or any direct attack on the unions. So we're left with that we have a Labour government, we have a weakened union movement, and we're trying to fight back. But in my view, there is no space in the current situation for a resurgence of rank and file movements. There's no space for a reinvention of the Liaison Committee. The only space is the constant, as we do, political fight. So my end point is this: what we bring to the movement, what we bring to the balance of class forces, what we bring to intervening is an appreciation that industrial and political issues are totally intertwined. That those trade unionists and those else who say industrial matters are from the industrial sector and political for political, that's, in my view, the heart of the problem that we have to face and we have to attack. And that, in my view, is where agency, we can make our own history by ensuring that every industrial issue is raised in a political forum. Anyway, go on, let them loose.
Marvellous. Thank you very much for that, Roger. Brilliant. Very informed run through the history of our movement, guided as ever by your sharp class and Marxist analysis. Very good. I would say, by the way, in answer to one of your comments, I think you probably did better with the pen than you would do with the shovel. So stick with your day job, would be my advice. I said at the beginning that you would probably stimulate some thoughts and some discussion, and there has been a number of questions that have come in. I'm going to go through a few of them. Maybe I'll read you 3 and give you time to think about them, and then I'll go and do another 3, something like that, if that's okay with you. I'll start with one from Michael Bain. Is a rank and file movement possible today, which is what you were just discussing, with the fragmented working class on temporary contracts, insecure employment and cost of living pressure? Also, he says that he's found sectionalism within trade unions to be a problem. You know, arms manufacturers, nuclear power, oil workers, they all have their arguments. How do we bring all these competing interests together with anti-capitalist political strategies? There's one. There's an easy one for you, Roger. I'm sure you can answer that. Then I've got another one. Malcolm Wallace. Is it fair to say that every Labour government eventually failed because of their wages and social attacks on working people and their families? A similar one from Janet Newsham, who says, do you think the current situation with the Labour Party and the Employment Rights Bill is reminiscent of the time of the social contract and trade unions silenced, hoping for some improvements? We see that now, you know, the Employment Rights Bill is full of proposed individual employment rights, but lacking, certainly in practice, if not in words, any effective trade union or collective rights. There's 3. Do you want to have a go at those, or shall I read you? I best add, hadn't I, before you forget?
Yeah, I have an increasingly short memory span, so it's best
to then.
Well, yes, absolutely. I think the sectionalism is an excellent point, because even in the minority movement in the 20s and the Liaison Committee in the 60s and 70s, basically what was happening was each group, each union, and within unions, groups had their own extremely impressive activists and rank and file movement. But as you say, they didn't link up. The genius of the Liaison Committee people was to say, look, we are linking up. And this is where Bert Ramilson came in, and that's where the politics comes in, isn't it? To say, look, your class, as a class, we're all being oppressed, we're all being exploited, and we're being exploited by the common class enemy, backed by a political system, a judicial system, a cultural system that encourages that. And if it wasn't sectionism, it was by gender, by age, by region, by accent, by nationality, etc., etc. So divide and rule has been a long established practice of the British ruling class. And of course, what they call wokeism, the cultural wars, are further just mischievous divide and rule. But of course, although it's mischievous, and many of them, and I unfortunately know some of them, think it's a bit of a laugh, it actually, as we know, has desperately serious repercussions for individuals and groups who are then persecuted. And we're at a tipping point where that may happen. On the question of labour and wages, yes, of course, I do. I mean, you know, it may be a little bit overly economistic, But at the end of the day, trade unions are first and foremost there to defend and advance wages and terms and conditions. There's no question. I've done 7 interviews this week on the bin strike, and they keep asking, what's going on? Why won't Unite behave? And you just say, look, your employer comes and says to you, I'm cutting your wage. It's what are you supposed to do? And wages have always been important, not only because they represent labor. Wages is the what you get, the income from working, while profits are the income from ownership. And one of the slogans of the left in America over the last 20 years, as we have here, is the neoliberal solution, the globalization solution, has rewarded owners and punished earners as a slogan. And that's where the Trump and the Reform and the far right in Italy and France get their motivation, that you attack owners even though you represent owners. And that's how they get away with it, by saying, yes, earners have been neglected, we will remedy that. And they're arguing as a solidarity of national interest. And we hear that from the Labour government, the national interest. Well, we've always said there's no such thing as the national interest. There's a class interest. And what they pose as a national interest is the capitalist interest and not the working class interest. And that seems to me an important area in which we can strike back and say, in whose interests actually are you operating? As far as the question of, are we swapping our militancy for a mess of porridge or pottage, a mess of pottage in this feeble employment bill? Well, the word of the decade, or the word of this year, is transactional. President Trump is transactional. What the hell? But anyway, what I assume they mean is what's going on, that the Labour government are saying, look, here, we're going to give you some sweeties in exchange for you being quiescent. Now, some of the union leaders are doing that, but they're not doing it because of this employment law. They're doing it because they can't see any other way forward. They've lost, unfortunately, and Unison might be a sad example, they've lost the industrial battle. They've lost the shop steward battle. And so what they're pinning everything is on the Labour government. So of course they're going to suck it up to them. And of course they're going to suck up what they offer. But as we saw in 1979 and we saw in 1969, unless they're very, very careful, they're going to go the same way. They're going to go the same way, alienate their own supporters. And this promise of the green, sunny uplands soon will disintegrate, and then you get the bitter disillusion that turns people to the right. So yeah, important questions and dangerous times.
Thanks very much. A couple of other questions then. Tony Conway asks, can you outline the interrelationship between broad lefts, which we're operating, as you said, under Bert Ramilson and Kevin Halpern, and rank and file organisations? So that's one. I'll ask you another one. Do you believe that a fractured trade union, with all its sectionality, will ever be as strong as it was in the early years? I think you've kind of answered that one, but that one comes from Louisa. And one more. You spoke of triggers in your presentation that can light a fuse to galvanise workers to fight back. You mentioned a few of them. What do you think might be a modern day trigger to get the working class going? Could it be Trump? Could it be Palestine? Could it be, joining the dots of that austerity has imposed on workers? There's your next three.
Well, when people like me always ask, we always fall back on the notion that it's the dialectic. And I was recently admonished by a senior trade union. They say, you always say it's the dialectic. So the answer to Tony, as he well knows, is it's the dialectic that rank and file were saying that the broad left was designed to win positions in unions at every level of left-wingers, of sympathetic left-wingers. But as my mate Tom Sibley often says, you've got to keep them honest. So it's not enough, as we know, to elect them, but you've got to keep them honest. And interestingly, the new head of industrial relations at the London School of Economics, the new young bright thing from America, his major work is on how you do that. How, if you elect a politician or a union leader on a left-wing program, how do you keep them honest? How do you keep them to their promises? Now, the question for the answer to that was rank and file, that the rank and file activists, and they don't naturally have to call them rank and file. We can call them shop stewards, we can call them reps, whatever, but it's grassroots activists who keep them honest by constantly pushing. So I would say broad left and rank and file was a classic dialectic. The broad left fed off the rank and file activists, getting the vote out, pushing motions forward. But the rank and file relied on broad left allies within the structure of the union to allow them to function as they did. Because in previous, particularly in the 1950s, when the rank and file tried to do this, then because you had unsympathetic officials, they were expelled and decimated and in many ways blacklisted as well. So it is important that there's that constant link between the two, but it doesn't have to be rank and file. You can just call them grassroots activists. They don't have to be in it quite so formalized. And of course, with modern technology, we can argue that looser frameworks are probably appropriate and more likely than the more formal ones of before. In terms of a fractured trade union movement, yeah, I mean, it's a constant problem. The TUC, and I've known every TUC General Secretary since 1972, and even Paul, the current one, who briefly was a student of mine, don't seem to be the most important people with regard to unity. I'm very interested in this book I'm writing on the West Indies in the 30s. It was all about solidarity. I'm very interested in solidarity, solidarity forever. All our slogans are solidarity slogans. But when we look at what the Liaison Committee called unity in action, and we want to call solidarity, it's absolutely very difficult to get people to look up from their daily grind. Really very difficult to look beyond their immediate struggle and to join up the dots in a political way. And what happens is in bad times, as we're experiencing, when there's a downward pressure on cost of living, when people are deliberately fed misinformation, it's very difficult to counter it. And I don't think the union movement at the moment is doing enough propaganda. That's why at the very beginning, the General Federation, the IEA, the trade union friends, all of these groups are so immensely important because you've got to drive the message. And it's constantly this thing, and it's a shame I haven't got it in front of me, but G.D.H. Cole in 1924 wrote a brilliant polemic telling us the importance of matching industrial with political struggle, because it's the politics that enables people to see beyond their immediate exploiter. And if you've been listening to the Scunthorpe steelworkers, they really aren't interested in anything other than their job and the survival of their job, which is absolutely right. It's not a criticism, but they're not able to see beyond that at the moment. And that's difficult, very difficult indeed. As far as triggers are concerned, well, I started by talking about what are called necessary and sufficient conditions. So necessary conditions are relatively poor wages, insecure employment, general exploitation. And what we're seeing also now is a pushback on a range of social, cultural, and community issues that are associated with militant trade unionism and socialist politics generally. They are necessary, but we have them a lot and nothing happens. So we also have to look at what's called sufficient conditions. That is, what else is going on that enables people to rise up above it? And we've seen it in Turkey recently. People on mass action in the streets, maybe Trump in America. But I agree, I'm at a loss. I don't understand why the people in the Lake District aren't permanently demonstrating against shit in the water. You know, I just don't get it. I don't understand why at the moment things are so quiet that people are accepting it. Maybe it is that we've been under the cosh for too long, but I do put a huge blame on the current Labour government. They're not educating, they're not propagandizing, they're not linking, they're not letting us say we need to stand together. And also the weakness of the Communist Party, which was a major factor in the 60s and now has dwindled despite heroic efforts to a minimum. So I don't know where the next trigger comes from, but I do remember very long time ago when I first came across Tony Union, the PCS, and they were all full of politics at national level. I mean, I can't tell you, there was more politics than there was Guinness in a Dublin pub. But the thing that triggered real change was the sacking of 3 workers in a tiny office on the South Coast. In other words, it wasn't big ideas, it wasn't massive, it came from nowhere. And so probably we don't know. But what we do know is that when it happens, when something captures the imagination, when something pushes us and changes our way of looking, it won't be the ones who've been shouting the loudest in the union executives, right? It'll be people who have been grassroots activists who hopefully will pick up the baton and run and make the difference. But I'm sorry, I can't predict where that will come. But it won't come from Trump. It will come from some much more important but less obvious place.
Thank you for that. You've mentioned a couple of times that you're writing a book on the West Indies. So our next question is going to test another bit of your international knowledge, and it comes from Grace Simpson, who asks, have you come across any mention of the Yugoslav system of worker self-management by the architects of the Liaison Committee? Is it at all possible that this shop floor level mode of managing industry was influential in the UK?
Oh, that's a thanks for that. I mean, when you have as many dead brain cells as I do, it's very useful if somebody gives them a nudge. So yeah, I mean, the industrial democracy debate, the Bullock report and the Yugoslav model was, as you say, quite rightly, a big debate. And when Tony Benn was in office in the 70s, there was the question of Meriden motorbikes and others, where the notion was these were British industries that had been mismanaged as usual by British companies. They'd taken the money out instead of reinvesting. And the view was, well, look, we need these industries, we can keep them. And why don't we create Spanish style, Yugoslavian style, autonomous workers' collectives? And that became quite attractive and quite popular, as did the notion of industrial democracy. But I was always reminded of what Marx himself said about groups. He said, basically, what you're trying to do is create a socialist world behind the backs of the capitalist system. That whatever you may think and whatever the good intentions and whatever the arguments, at the end of the day, you're still dependent and functioning within a dominant and determinant capitalist system of relations. And so it can't last. So in a way, it was very important as an aspiration and to some extent an inspiration of what workers could do. But the view was it was a distraction, because at the end of the day, you still are dealing within a capitalist state relations, and you have to face it front on and not try to create these little conclaves away from the main stream of events. But yeah, it was important debate, and it's certainly one that we should never forget, you know, because it's part of the story, isn't it? It's part of our future, but I'm not sure it's part of our present.
Thanks. This one is more of a comment than a question. It might have to be, you know, we're coming up to the end of our session now. So this one is more, and it comes from Linda Rook, and she says, you mentioned that some call the tech industry as feudal tech. And she said, I'd argue that elements of her sector, which is the entertainment industry, are also in the feudal era. The video games industry, which is seen to be a modern day kind of, growing industry, which receives tax benefits from the UK government and is a multi-million industry benefiting a few individuals, still refuse to come to the table to agree collective agreements. But she says they're pushing back on this, as is their sister union in the USA, as we know, who are currently on strike with the video games producers. As I say, more of a comment than a question, but any comments in response?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think to some extent there is a lot of hope there because the people involved are fantastic. Some of the activists and some of the movement in the States and over here has been remarkable. And some of it does remind me of early days of trying to organize even in the car industry. I mean, people forget the car industry was an elitist industry run by billionaires. And Ford, I mean, he was a fascist. He absolutely hated the unions and shot them dead, shot the union activists dead. But then it changed. So there is a possibility to win in those areas. And it's very, very important that we never stop trying. But I think the point is made that this is where, maybe we can end on this, is where the power of the state is so important. Lenin wrote about the revolution. Lenin said a revolution is where class changes, the ruling class change, not a coup d'etat, not a minor shuffling of the top table. And the reason he was so keen to remind us of state power is because at the end of the day, state power, through all its elements, is what enables these tech people in the entertainment industry, wherever they be, to break the law on a regular basis, to treat their workers appallingly, to actually fail even to invest in their own businesses. They're crooks, basically. And you said they act like feudal lords and we're just their vassals. It's really shocking. But the way forward, besides fighting, is to fight politically, is to move the struggle from the industrial to the political sphere, and to recognize that the only way to get this done is through getting the government and the state that we need. So we can go back to what, at the end of the day, the Liaison Committee was all about. It wasn't the wage, it was wages, but it was fighting to protect the organizations that allow workers some power in the workplace, the trade unions, and they understood that that was grace and favor from the government of the day and the state apparatus behind it. And the critical moment in modern history, as I'm sure most people appreciate, was the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because before that, there was notions that you've got to be careful because people might go communist. So we might have to make concessions. We might have to famously keep our friends close, but our enemies closer. But once the Soviet Union had gone, and with it, the socialist democracies throughout Europe, that was a green light, wasn't it, to globalization, to neoliberalism. But what those things meant in the workplace was a rolling back of collective workers' rights. Never mind individual rights. Individual rights cannot function without collective protection on the ground, not through the courts. So you're absolutely right to point to these areas of significant economic development, of technological improvement, where big bosses behave like they've always done. And the only way around that is to turn the industrial struggle into the political struggle. And that's what they understood in the 70s, and that's what we have to reignite in the 2020s.